A happy Easter to you all. He is risen. Should we do that one again? He is risen. Wonderful. If you're a visitor here, my name's Rupert. I'm one of the leaders at Community Church, and just going to share a few thoughts with you for a few minutes. Enough time if you've not made a little flower and you'd like to. Where's Kirsty gone? She's gone. Oh, there she is. So if you haven't got any materials, mine is rubbish. So it's setting the example of how bad you can be. And we're thinking about a couple of texts this morning. We're thinking about a passage from Isaiah 35 that Leslie read out right at the beginning about flourishing and life emerging in the desert and the wilderness. And then we're thinking about John 20 that Esther just read out a little bit earlier about that first morning. And we've entitled this morning, A Joy in the Morning, springing out of one of the Psalms where it talks about weeping will last during the night, but joy will come in the morning. But it could also be joy in the morning. So is it joy in the morning or is it joy in the morning? As we've just finished a short sermon series thinking about good grief and how part of our human experience of journeying through loss and death. And so we reach Easter Sunday. I came across a word this week that I'd never heard before. You may have heard of genocide. It's in the news at the moment, but have you heard of the word democide? Anybody heard of the word democide? Toby? No. Really? There's always one bright spark around, isn't there? The intentional killing of an unarmed or disarmed person by government agents acting in their authoritative capacity and pursuing government policy or high command. State-sponsored murder. This was coined by a Holocaust historian called Rudolf Rummel, and he's looked at the 20th century statistics. Apparently, according to him, more people have died through democide than any other unnatural causes of death in the 20th century. He estimates that 262 million people died through state-sponsored murder in the 20th century at the hand of the authorities and the powers and the rulers of their own country. Most of those people are unknown and unnamed. And while this is maybe not proven, in the last few weeks we have heard one name in the news, Alexei Navalny, likely a state-sponsored murder while in prison in Russia because he was a threat to the power of Putin. On Monday night, a few of us gathered here and others from other churches to listen to a dramatic one-man performance called I Am Mark, where Steph Smart recounted through memory the Gospel of Mark, left out a few portions just for the sake of time. But it was a very moving experience hearing this rendition of the whole Gospel over a couple of hours. What struck me, listening to Mark's Gospel dramatized in that way, was the inevitable clash between Jesus and the powers and authorities, those who were ruling in Jerusalem and Israel at that time. Jesus challenged the powers and authorities. He was a threat to the system. He was subversive, upturning the laws of the day, the sacred laws, and challenging those who had so much to lose. there was this inevitability, listening to this gospel recounted in one sitting, that there would be this confrontation, that those with power would use their power to destroy the threat that was Jesus. In one sense, it was, listening to it, such a human story of jealousy and judgment, of ambition and selfishness. What was also interesting, listening to I Am Mark, was how the crowds loved Jesus as the gospel went on. But at the end, they were turned by the authorities, stirring up the crowd against Jesus. So they cried, "Crucify him, crucify him." But it wasn't just the cries to crucify him, but it was the fact that no one stood up and said, "No, don't do that. He's an innocent man." Not one person cried out, "Don't do that." Listening to this dramatic presentation, I'd like to think that I would be one of the people that might have stood up and said, "No, don't do that." But this dawning realization that I would have been part of the crowds, just like everybody else. Swept up in the groundswell and the momentum of the powers and the authorities as they manipulated the crowds. I would have been there too, mocking and giving my consent to state-sanctioned murder. What is different, I think, with Jesus is that this blameless man walked willingly towards his death. Even when Pilate, Roman leader in the province, couldn't find any reason to condemn Jesus, Jesus himself wasn't helping himself by remaining silent and not answering any of the questions that were asked of him. So Pilate says to Jesus, "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" And Jesus' response was, "You would have no power over me unless it were given to you from above." In other words, Pilate, you're not taking my life. I'm willingly giving it. So all the powers and evil of humanity coalesced that day in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. And the worst that the powers and the authorities could do were thrown against this innocent man who was willingly walking towards his death and who threatened the status quo. And the empire did what the empire does. And with its greatest weapon, death, it came against Jesus and he was murdered on the cross. And if that had been the end of the story, it's likely that Jesus would have been one of the millions and millions of people that was a victim of democide, state-sponsored murder. And we wouldn't have heard his name or known who he was. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story. The ultimate weapon of evil and empire couldn't hold Jesus. That's what we celebrate this morning. That death couldn't hold this innocent man. And that the ultimate weapon of empire, death, had lost its sting, not through force or power or violence or any of the other weapons of empire, but through the beautiful act of self-giving, co-suffering love. I've read this quote before, but I think it merits reading again. I read it a couple of years ago on Easter Sunday. I think it probably merits reading every Easter Sunday as we reflect on the place of the church in our culture and the place of the cross in disarming the powers and authorities. The cross, this is a quote from Brian Zand, and he says, "The cross of state-sponsored violence by which the rulers of the fallen world order retain their power became the means by which the world is liberated from their tyranny and reorientated around love. I think we could probably just stop there. That's extraordinary. This was entirely unanticipated by the principalities and powers. Pilate didn't understand it. Herod didn't understand it. Caiaphas didn't understand it. Caesar didn't understand it. And I dare say the disciples and maybe you and I didn't really understand it. But what Jesus was doing was beyond anything they could imagine. It was a radical new paradigm. Jesus was remaking the world on a beautiful new idea. The principalities and powers might be exposed and extinguished by the truth of unquenchable love. And so the joy in this morning is that we get to participate in this life, that death has lost its sting and could not hold the innocent man who gave himself willingly on Good Friday. And this participation in the life of Jesus, it echoes forward for us to our own future death and resurrection, the hope that we have in the age to come. The hope that we have in the age to come where death is destroyed and mourning is no longer. Mourning, M-O-U-R-N. But this participation in the life of Jesus, that death could not hold him, also echoes backwards into our lives now. And this passage from Isaiah 35 that the prophetic community in this church has been musing on over the last few months, and this painting from Leslie, which I think you just finished on Friday or Saturday, of crocuses budding forth in the midst of the desert, is a prophetic promise in Isaiah at the time that their exile in Babylon, where the Babylonian Empire had come and taken them captive and raped and pillaged their villages and their people, that they would return home after all that destruction and the desert and the wilderness that they were experiencing, that there would be flourishing again, that crocuses and life would burst forth in the desert. Something would bloom and flourish in the most unpromising of circumstances. And what was the cause of this flourishing according to the text in Isaiah? Your God is coming. That was it. Your God is coming. Flourishing comes because God has come and is coming. And when he comes, the text says, then the lame will leap and those who speak will sing for joy. Springs will gush forth. God's people will be crowned with everlasting joy. Sorrow and mourning will disappear, and they will be filled with joy and gladness because our God has and is coming. Joy in the morning, but also joy in the morning. And then in the passage in John's Gospel, we read this story about Mary Magdalene. I spent about 2 months reading and reflecting on this passage last summer, almost every day, just finding myself in this story and reflecting on loss and grief and mourning in my own life. And this passage where Mary Magdalene, in her grief and disappointment, this had not turned out the way that she had expected. She turns up that Sunday morning, early in the morning at the tomb, expecting to find the body of Jesus laid out in this tomb. And yet she turns up and she finds this massive stone that sealed off the tomb rolled away. And she goes off and she finds two other disciples, Simon Peter, and John, the author of the gospel, who's unnamed in the text. And they run to the tomb, and they get there before Mary Magdalene, and they look inside this tomb, and they see the tomb is empty and the grave clothes folded up on the slab where they should have expected the body of Jesus to be lying. And then this very strange thing happens. The text just says, the two disciples went home. I spent about a month just thinking about those few words. And then they went home. Like, why? Why did you go home? And why did you go home and leave Mary there when she was upset and weeping and crying? Why did you not stay with Mary if she refused to go home? Why did you go home? Did you really know what was happening, male disciples? Did you really have any understanding of what was going on? Why did you go home? And why did Mary stay there? Why did Mary stay at this tomb, at the place of her greatest disappointment and grief and loss? Why did you stay there, Mary? And then she sees these two angels wearing white clothes. And she asks, where have you taken the body? Do you know where the body is? And then she turns around and she sees this man who she thinks is a gardener, and she asks the same question. And then Jesus, because it was no gardener, Jesus calls her name, Mary. And in that moment, she becomes the first person that sees the risen Jesus. What would have happened if the two male disciples had stayed? Jesus, in his grace, that evening, why was it the evening? Why didn't he go to them straight away? But in his grace, in their locked door, because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities, Jesus turns up to them too. But Mary, because she stays in her place of grief and disappointment, finds joy in the morning. Or is it joy in the morning? And I think this Easter, in the midst of this state-sponsored murder of Jesus, where all the weapons of empire come against him but could not hold him, death has been defeated and life bursts forth, the invitation is for us to stay and find life in the desert, to stay in our places of loss and grief and disappointment, because there is joy in the morning. Or is it joy in the morning? Who's done their flowers? So I spent 2 months in this passage in John's Gospel, pretty much every day, just holding some of those places of loss and grief and mourning and pain and disappointment, and just holding them in my hands, in imagining the life of God bursting forth in our lives now, in my life, in your life. And in a moment, we're going to sing again, and there's an opportunity to come and put our flowers on this barren twig, tree thing. as a sign, maybe a prayer or an act of life that we want to see. So we'll do that in a moment. But what I'd like us to do is maybe just invite us to hold our hands out. And where are your places of pain, of disappointment, of loss? Can you imagine holding them in these hands just now? In the presence of God. And if you have a flower, maybe you want to put the flower in your hands. As a prayer, Holy Spirit, come and bring the life that we celebrate this morning because of our participation in the life of Jesus, and bring life to those barren places, those desert and wilderness places, those places of pain and heartache and loss and disappointment. And I wondered this morning whether there were people here who you just feel like you're hanging on with your fingertips. This morning, I pray, breathe life, Holy Spirit, into those people. Maybe you've come here for the first time this morning. Maybe you don't even really know Jesus. But you've come looking for hope, looking for life. And right now, maybe as you just hold out your hands, the life of Jesus can come to you. Maybe you've wondered whether life is even worth living. In this moment, may seeds of life burst forth for you. Maybe you feel oppressed and beaten up. Maybe you feel that the powers and authorities are squashing you down. This morning, may you know the liberation that comes through the death and resurrection of Jesus. That light could burst forth in that place of squashedness. Holy Spirit, maybe you've been so disappointed that you're not even sure it's okay to hope again. This morning, I pray that hope can bud like these crocuses in the desert. Because our God has come and is coming. Our God has come to you and is coming. Our God has burst forth. Let hope arise afresh.